Let's talk a little bit more about the trade side of things. The Trump administration's crackdown on illegal fentanyl is now extending to India, which the U.S. has identified as the second biggest supplier of precursor chemicals and drug-making equipment after China. Let's get to Bloomberg News senior reporter Dan Stumpf joining us now with more from New Delhi. This is very interesting. So how do you think India fits into this whole murky trade in chemicals?
Well, thanks so much for having me. Yes, that's right. India, much of the focus in the global fight against fentanyl has fallen on China. And of course, the Trump administration has been extremely vocal about China's role in the fentanyl trade and has placed a number of tariffs that we know have been rolled back recently on China for its role in the trade. What we do know, however, is that India is a growing conduit, a growing node in this global fentanyl trade. And that's been called out by a number of different figures within the Trump administration and previous administrations. This year alone, the Department of Justice has really ratcheted up its fight against alleged producers of fentanyl precursors that are allegedly supplying fentanyl precursors to the U.S. and to drug cartels in Mexico as well. So we know that India is a rising sort of node in this global fentanyl trade. Now, a major sort of difference between India and China, of course, is the role in which India is playing in its own fight against fentanyl here. A number of figures within the administration have told us that India has been a major source of cooperation in the fight against fentanyl with the U.S. And that's really in contrast to China and a big reason why so much of the crackdown has fallen on China in this fight.
And it seems like, according to your sources, that there's a threat of maybe potentially more tariffs if India doesn't help with the control of these sort of chemicals in some ways. How worried should Indian authorities be about this?
Well, we do know that this is something that has been discussed within the administration. I think that India is already quite nervous about its sort of place in the global tariff war. India's already looking at 50% tariffs right now, and the reason for that in the end wasn't fentanyl. It was India's role in buying Russian crude oil. And so we know that now India is starting to roll back its purchases of Russian crude oil, and there's a strong hope that a deal with the Trump administration over trade is in the works and perhaps even imminent that's going to come through and help roll back some of those tariffs. But we do know that that New Delhi and the administration of Prime Minister Narendra Modi is very conscious of this growing fentanyl threat. India is an increasing supplier of global pharmaceuticals, and the administration here has made it clear that it wants to continue to play a growing role in the global pharmaceutical trade. Now, China is also a major supplier of global pharmaceuticals, and the sort of overlap in the fentanyl trade and the pharmaceutical trade is very well known, and there's a lot of opportunities for bad actors to sort of emerge as these industries grow, and that is certainly something that New Delhi is conscious of.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, India is known as like the pharmacy of the world, right? The scale that you're seeing in the chemicals and the pharmaceutical industry certainly complicates things. How difficult is it then in terms of controlling the flow of these sort of fentanyl-related products then? How can they actually better control it?
So it certainly is a growing problem. I mean, there's sort of two major industries that India has seen a lot of growth in. Of course, we know the production of finished pharmaceuticals is a major growing industry in India. India has exploded in its trade in the global generic drugs, in the generic drugs industry. And then there's a secondary industry, which is the chemicals trade, the so-called APIs. These are the pharmaceutical chemicals that are then used to manufacture the finished pharmaceuticals that we all sort of see in our medicine cupboards and things like that. And this is where the fentanyl precursor trade comes in, because this is where much of the concern and the fight around fentanyl has now fallen. It's on these precursors, it's on these chemicals that are used to make fentanyl. And the trouble with many of these precursors is that, first of all, there's a huge number of them. It's very difficult to control. As one former official told us, it's sort of like a game of whack-a-mole. You're constantly sort of in a race to try to find these new precursor chemicals and control them and get a hold of them. And then on top of that, many of them have legitimate uses that are going into legitimate drugs and can be redirected to illegitimate uses. And so it's really quite a challenging sort of game that law enforcement has to play, and that takes a lot of global cooperation.